the defensive tackles that they lose. And are you a bit disappointed? Not that Sark didn't do his best and the coaching staff to try to replace those guys, and there were few options out there, but is that the biggest, I don't want to call it a failure, but again, mission not necessarily accomplished, doing something a little bit more substantial to replace those guys in the middle?
Yeah, so I'm in between on this because I think if you go depth, we're better at that position than we were a year ago. Now, top end talent, we're just not there. We don't have two guys on the roster that are going to be top 40 picks in the NFL draft next year. We don't. But I've heard really good positive reviews with Bill Norton. I guess he's come in and he's way stronger and bigger than they thought he'd be coming in, and he's pushing people around, which is really good to hear. We really need that, especially at the nose tackle position. So I think that's positive. I also believe whatever Sark says at this point. Sark has not lied to the point of when we needed defensive tackles in the portal, he came out and said, we need more guys in the middle of our defensive line, period. And guess what? We went out about a couple weeks later and got another guy or two. So I would love to hear at his next press conference, someone ask him, how do you feel about the interior of your defensive line? If he says, I feel good about it, or I feel like it's headed in the right direction, then I'm all on board, because he has come out and said things about position groups when it's not there. I know a couple years ago when all we really had at wide receiver was Xavier Worthy, he come out and said, we're not good enough at wide receiver. We have one really good wide receiver. We don't have another one. We need to get another one. They went and got A.D. Mitchell. And he's like, oh, we're good now. We're good. You don't have to worry about it. And that's what I like about Steve Sarkisian. He's been pretty damn transparent. Unlike, no offense, well, some offense to Tom Herman, who kind of lied through his teeth, made himself look better than he really was and stuff like that. Steve Sarkisian has come out and said, hey, I need this. And then he goes, gets it. Hey, I need this. He goes and gets it. If he needs something, he'll go and get it. And if he didn't get it, then he'll admit, like, this is probably going to be the weak point of the team. I'm kind of worried about the depth here. So we'll see what he says. I'm hoping someone will ask that question, because they definitely should, and he'd give him a good answer.
So it's my thought process at this point, Matthew, that Georgia, Ohio State are 1 and 2 in the country, and these are the reasons. Number one is just the flat out brand name that some people are just going to put them there because they partially earned it, or they just have a brand name. And for Georgia, obviously, I believe that Georgia's got the best football program in the country, and they've had the most recent success. Ohio State's Ohio State, but getting past reputation and brand and all of that a lot of people vote for, and getting to the nuts and bolts of the football team and what truly matters, is I think that Georgia has the best roster in the country. Waves and waves and waves of guys. And we know when they were fielding those 21 and 22 defenses that the front seven just had guys that if you looked at the stat sheet, you would never be impressed, but you had to watch them play because they had NFL players and they could just rotate them out. But if you take maybe the top 15 or 20 players on a roster, maybe that's Ohio State, because they had so many guys return that could have went to the NFL, but they brought them back. And then you add Caleb Downs, Quinshon Judkins, Will Howard, and those guys. And I think that's accurate, but where do you think Texas stands in that comparison?
I would say 4, right behind Oregon, and I'm only saying that because they took two guys that I've said it for a while now, I think could have changed the whole landscape of who wins the national championship this season. They took Jamari Caldwell, who was 100% headed to Texas before Bo Davis got there, and he left. And then Jamari Caldwell paused his recruitment for like 2 weeks, didn't hear anything, and then all of a sudden Texas took way too long to fill the defensive line coach position, and he went to Oregon. Jamar Muhammad, who I want Jamar Muhammad? Absolutely. But it was the kind of the same thing with Terrence Brooks. These guys wanted their spot, like period, point blank. I don't want to compete. That the second cornerback's my spot. And Steve Sarkisian was like, no, we'll promise you that you will be able to compete for the second starting cornerback spot. They didn't want to do that. Jamar Muhammad went to Oregon. Terrence Brooks transferred to Illinois. And I actually don't disagree with what Curry there. Texas line, I think, is better than Ohio State's. I don't even think Mark would disagree with that. But yeah, Ohio State's defense line is miles ahead of where we are this year. So that does make a difference. But that's the thing too. That's funny. If Texas and Ohio State played each other, your strength would be going up against our strength, and then your weakness would be going up against our weakness. I guess when you look at it, defense line versus offensive line, and then who would I say quarterback wise? I'm going to take Quinn Ewers every day. over Will Howard. And I think that's what this season's going to come down to. I really believe this is a 2020 Alabama situation where if Quinn studied the offense in the offseason, learned everything he needs to learn, and executes the way he can execute, I think he can have a Mac Jones season. And I think we have the talent at the wide receiver position that Alabama did just because of the injuries they sustained. Obviously, if those guys are healthy, they went to another level, but they weren't. They really only had Devontae Smith at that point. I think we have 3 or 4 guys that can equal the production of a Devontae Smith and the other 2 or 3 guys they had behind him. Obviously, if they were healthy, we wouldn't be able to match what Jalen Waddle and Henry Ruggs that year, but they were hurt. So that is the pool I think Tech's going to have to swim in if they want to win a national championship. I think it's going to have to be carried by the offense and Quinn Ewers in particular, and the defense is going to be just going to have to get timely stops, red zone stops, third down, stuff like that. Take the ball from the other team's offense when they can, and that's how I think this team is going to be built to win. I think it's going to be last year. It was Texas wide receivers kind of had to carry Quinn Ewers a little bit in certain games. I think Quinn Ewers is going to have to carry the wide receivers in certain games. It's his turn. It's his time. He's had enough opportunity in this system. This will be his 3rd year, and he's the highest or one of the highest rated high school quarterback recruits in the history of rankings. So it's time for him to live up to that billing.
So, folks, just to clarify, if you're not familiar, because he was in obscurity at Houston, Caldwell is a guy that racked up 8 or 9 sacks, tackles for loss in that range. And yeah, he's a great addition for Oregon. And then, of course, if you watch college football, especially down the stretch, you saw Washington play a ton of big-time games, and Jabbar Muhammad was one of the very best at the corner spot. And again, Cordy, I don't disagree with you. My point was more not Ohio State's the best or second best team in the country, just if you just rated players, if you just ranked players, and they could be like 8 of them could be wide receivers, which doesn't do you a whole lot of good. Just saying, if you rank like every team and just said these are the most talented teams, and regardless of what position, 3 of them could be quarterbacks, but you were just ranking the best players, that they might have the 20 best players on a roster is all I was saying there. Yeah, they've got offensive line issues, and I don't think they addressed them. Now we'll see how good they can develop an offensive line. If you've got a good offensive line coach, and I think that that's the position. I think this is pretty well known. I don't know that we would get a whole lot of argument that I think the offensive line is the trickiest position to coach, develop, trickiest position to form a starting lineup in a rotation because of the mixing and matching guard, tackle, center. They all have different responsibilities, different skill sets. You want your best 5 athletes out there, but that doesn't always equate to what positions they can play. And so the mixing and matching is part of the nuance too, to getting the right guys out there. And of course, you want a 6, 7, 8 that's pretty strong too.
100%. I mean, Sark has been asked that multiple times in the offseason when he got to Texas. He was like, we didn't have enough offensive linemen to field like a real spring game. We had 17 wide receivers on scholarship and only like 8 or 9 offensive linemen. He's like, that's just not going to do it. Now we have 8 or 9 guys that I'd feel confident in playing. So that's how you win football games. And Sark's done a great job of recruiting there. And that's the thing too. Like when I think about those top 4, if you break it down offensively, like I think Texas probably has the best quarterback between Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas. I think Texas probably has the best offensive line between Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas. I think Texas might have the best running backs. I mean, there's definitely an argument. Ohio State could easily say number 1 on that, but Texas can argue they have the best 2 running backs between those 4 teams. And then wide receivers, Ohio State definitely is number 1. I think Texas is number 2 in that. So offensively, we're there. It's the defense. That's the question. It honestly is. If the defense can be average, an average SEC defense, this team can win the national championship.
It's kind of funny because I'm looking at Will Howard much differently than I looked at him anytime in the last 2.5 years. If you would have asked me about Will Howard before he went to Columbus, I would have said a lot of positive things about Will Howard, because my memories of Will Howard were that basically he stepped in for Adrian Martinez. Boom, he steps on the field. Suddenly they were throwing the ball downfield. He led a big comeback, and he played better than any Kansas State quarterback that we've seen in a long time. But that doesn't mean that he's an Ohio State quarterback or he's a national championship quarterback. That means for a 20th best team in the country that he was what they needed, and he played really well. And I think he's a heck of a player. But you put the stats down and you start to watch him, he put in some ugly games. He put some ugly games on tape where he would throw like 3 picks and 50% passing in a particular game. And I know every quarterback has those games, but he had them against some lackluster defenses like Oklahoma State. Now, since Ohio State has all this talent back from last year's team, plus they added to it, I will say that he should be better than Kyle McCord because he's got 2.5 years of experience and Kyle McCord had 0. Plus, he's got a run factor where he can escape, and if nobody's open, he can do something with it. That's in just looking at Will Howard. I don't think when you size it up the way you just did with Texas, Oregon, and Georgia, I think Ohio State does have a liability in trying to win a national championship. But when I size it up versus they had a team that was a drive away from being the number 1 seed in the playoff last year, and they've traded out a quarterback with no experience to start the season versus 2.5 years of winning football and mobility, plus all these guys have another year under their belts, then I start to think Ohio State's got a good shot.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because I know you and Steve talked about Will Howard, and I think he would have been great at Michigan. I know that point was made, but I also think Dylan Gabriel, that's another guy that I'm shocked Ohio State. I know he's not the best quarterback, but I think he's better than Will Howard. Like, I'm surprised they didn't go after him, honestly. That kind of shocked me. And I don't know if you would agree with this. I think the best case scenario is he's JT Barrett. I think that's kind of who he reminds me of.